This is the Philosominute, where I spell out everything that matters in about 5 minutes. Now, I don't normally like to get this far into the weeds on this podcast, but we have a very important news story from a few weeks ago that is going to radically change American society for quite a while. So I'm going to risk the nerdiness and give a history lesson. So for all of human history, slavery, which is people owning other people, has been a standard. In some ways, we could still argue it still is. And abolitionism, which is people freeing slaves, only started around 1315, and it only started gaining traction in the West by 1772. Now, around the same time, in 1776, the British colonies of the New World wanted to break free from their empire, and they had enough political issues with a common enemy that they weren't going to add in more things to fight about. Plus, abolitionists at the time also believed chattel slavery was so evil that the trend eventually would win out in a few decades. So they figured it wasn't a hill worth dying on. That really wasn't the case, though, obviously, and in the 1860s, the U.S. saw a really bad hill that many Americans died on. Now, the result of this, though, was complete abolitionism. But that wasn't really the end. Many of the former slave states didn't want ex-slaves integrating into their population, so they created Jim Crow laws to stop that. It was basically laws that would keep blacks and whites separate. And this was considered okay enough, and by the 1890s, in 1896, the Supreme Court ruled in Plessy v. Ferguson that everything could be separate as long as it was equal. Now, all of this was changed with Brown v. Board of Education in 1954, which basically ruled that separate but equal thing wasn't really equal. 10 more years of politics created the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. These were built to prevent discrimination from ever happening again. And that is the end of all racism in the United States. I am, of course, entirely kidding. But for the sake of how things matter, we're going to put a pin in this story and we're going to talk about gerrymandering. Essentially, in a voting system with representatives, you can divide out the votes in different ways. So with 6 people in a room and 3 votes, you could just give pairs of people those votes. The problem, though, is that if you know ahead of time that 4 of the people hate you, you might be able to fudge who gets the votes, and your 2 allies will get a vote each, and the 4 people will get a 3rd vote, and you'll win the election. This is obviously corruption at its normalest. The word gerrymandering itself was because Elbridge Gerry in 1812 tweaked his district so hard that it sort of looked like a salamander. But I digress. Since 1965, one of the Voting Rights Act rules eventually allowed gerrymandering based on race. The language is kind of hairy to parse through, but many states implied that a majority race had a collective right to vote, and it was being denied if they didn't have a racial majority in that district. In other words, a 5% group of people with one skin color should have a vote, even if there's only 4 votes to go around. This is basically racism with extra steps, and it has been the standard for most of our lifetimes. And that is what has recently gotten flipped in Louisiana v. Calais in April of 2026. And this is not a small thing. It affects 191, or over 1/3, of all the people who make laws in the United States that are not the president. This means that by the end of 2028, we may see 1/3 of our elected officials replaced by someone else. But this alludes to a greater problem in the human condition. This is a law that was designed to end racism, twisted into creating more racism. This represents a clear moral sickness within all of society. And I guarantee you, it's not just American society, this is human existence. There is something deeply morally wrong that we normalize and take for granted as fine. And we each individually are contributors to the waterfall of evil that we witness every day. You may not think yourself responsible, but your decision to purchase goods made by slaves from another country, or consume content created with sex trafficking victims that you don't know, or interacting with an unscrupulous corporation and allowing them to take your data or information. It makes you a fraction of a fraction, maybe of a fraction of a percent contributor to those large-scale evil actions. Your consent is essentially giving that power over, even if it's not much. But you take you and millions of others, it can be a lot of power. And we often look so much at what is missing, but we ourselves miss that it starts within ourselves. The only way to enact real political change is to manage our mind's politics first. We must get our mind in order. If this Voting Rights Act tells us anything, then we must be careful about the rules and boundaries we make. If we aren't aware of what we're thinking, we can often set standards that come back later to haunt us and harm others. Anyway, thank you for listening or watching. And please only interact if this added any meaning to your life. And I hope you have a philosophically improved week.